So we've already talked about progressivism in general. We've talked about what their goals were. We talked about the fact that essentially the progressives saw themselves as going through and really working very hard to try and bring about some level of fairness or something along those lines for those in society they saw as having the least rights or the least protections. And we said that this was going to include women and children in particular. So, for this section, we're going to talk about women in public life. We're going to talk a little bit about what was going on in regards to our nation at this time, what was going on in regards to society, and how were women able to function within that society? What jobs were they going to be taking? What things were they going to be doing, essentially? Because you have to take into account that while this is a point in time when there is a lot of change going on and you are starting to see women have more rights, you're seeing women have more opportunities and things like that, keep in mind that this is still around the turn of the century. So this is a point in time that you're still going to see a number of limitations based on what women were going to essentially be allowed to do at this point. So we're going to look today, as I said, at women in public life. What was going on in regards to women in the United States at this time? Now, it would be a mistake to say that if you look back to the very beginnings of this nation, if you go back even to colonial times, it would be a mistake to say that women had not been working. However, it would be correct to say that not a lot of women had jobs. You got to take into account the United States, from the earliest colonial times until after the Civil War, was predominantly an agrarian nation. We were a country that was really focused exclusively on farming. Up to the Civil War, we still lived in small towns and on farms. It wasn't until after the Civil War that we started moving to cities. It wasn't until that industrialization and that urbanization that we talked about that you're seeing more and more factories and more cities bringing more and more people there for the particular work. But in that case, we're really talking more about jobs than we are talking about specifically work. From the time the nation first began, women had been working in this nation. And we're going to talk about how or what kind of work that was at the outset versus how things were changing now that we were moving into the 20th century. Keep in mind, like I said before, progressivism was trying to ensure that the least within society were going to get the most protection. This would be women and children. So we're going to start out talking about working on farms. Now, for those of you who question it, working on farms is, quite a bit of effort. And it is still to this very day a very important industry. If you don't think so, think about that next time you go to get something to eat out of your refrigerator. And for centuries, one of the biggest things was trying to grow enough food to make sure that the population didn't starve to death. Now, while we have talked previously about mechanization, while we have talked about the way that we had more machinery that was getting more done with fewer people, while that is the case, there are a lot of things that were going on farms for women that really hadn't changed that much. In spite of the mechanization, in spite of the advancements in technology, in spite of the fact that we now had more food being grown by fewer people, the women who were living and working on these farms really didn't see their lives change that much. They saw things essentially remain the same. They kept working as they always had, which is why I said it's inaccurate to say that women had not been working. On the farms, and this goes back, like I said, to colonial times right up through when we're talking about here. It was the women on the farms who did, for example, all the cooking. 3 meals a day. That was going to be prepared by the mom or the wife on the farm as the day progressed. Secondly, you had all the cleaning. Now, this includes not just, you might think dusting or something like that. No, think about the fact about washing clothes. Think about the fact of cleaning the dishes after cooking and things like that. So you've got cooking, you've got cleaning. Sewing was of major importance. And we're not just talking about your clothing gets ripped and somebody sews it back together. No, in a lot of cases, we're talking about the actual putting together of clothing. Okay, you had to, sometimes go through and make your own clothes. You did have clothes that could be purchased at a store, of course, but those are going to cost a lot more. So you also had to look at the concept of sewing. And yes, There were the times that it was just mending ripped clothing, but sometimes it was the actual creation of clothing. Plus, two, you had child rearing. You had to raise the kids, and before there were public schools and whatnot, you were pretty much responsible for making sure your kids had some form of education. So there were a lot of responsibilities that had been left for the women on the farms to take care of. But that wasn't it. It wasn't just cooking, cleaning, sewing, and child rearing. You also had to help with crops and animals. So the women on the farms were essentially going through and doing two jobs. Okay, they were taking care of everything in regards to the home, but at the same time, they're going through and they're having to help, gather the crops, water the crops. They're going to have to feed the animals. They're going to have to milk the cows. They're going to have to go through and do all sorts of things. So women working on the farms at this time were working essentially two jobs, but weren't getting paid for it. So you can kind of look at it in that respect. Now, when we started moving to the cities, when we started to become much, much more industrialized, when we became much, much more urbanized, now we're going to talk about women in industry. Now, in this case, we're talking about women in industry. What we're talking about here is not just work, but people who have jobs and are getting some form of paycheck for that particular job. So, women in industry is going to talk about the different jobs that were becoming available and the women who were going through and actually taking those jobs and now working at factories or offices or different things. Now, at the turn of the century, at around 1900, you had somewhere in the range of 1 out of every 5 women held a job somewhere. Okay, so you're looking at 20% of the women in the nation are now working. Now, some of these women are working exclusively because they want some extra income or something like that, but others are working because that's the only income. So you have 1 out of 5, 20% of the female population at this time was going to have jobs. Now, where was it they were working? Okay, about half of the women at this point in time, about half of this workforce, so you're looking at probably, say, 10% of all the women in the country, were working in what's referred to as the garment trades. Now, when you hear garment trade, basically think about any and everything revolving around clothing. Now, that could be sewing clothes together, it could be cutting the cloth so that the clothes could be sewn together, all these different aspects of clothing, basically. And women are going to be, very much working in those particular trades. Now, part of this had to do with, as we said before, from having lived on farms and whatnot, you had to go through and do all the sewing and things along those lines. And so, in some cases, it was because they had some more skills or at least more experience in this particular trade. But even there, even in the garment trade and anywhere else, the jobs that women had tended to be the least skilled positions. Okay, these were the you could also refer to it as usually unskilled labor. It was the various jobs that didn't really require a ton of training. It was the work that didn't necessitate that you were going to go through and have years of experience or things like that. Keep in mind, this is a point in time where if you had various, a job, say it was shoemaking, then you had to go through and you had to apprentice yourself to someone who trained you how to do it, and that was still very common. So skilled positions, that was not really going to be for women. They were going to get the least skilled positions. And what's more, since they were getting the least skilled positions, they tended to get paid about half as much as the men did. Now, there were no minimum wage laws or anything like that at this point in time. There were no requirements or anything about how much different people were going to get paid for various jobs. That was simply between you and your employer. There was no, law or anything requiring that they do a minimum amount. So it was perfectly acceptable by most of society at this point that women were going to be paid less. Now, I mentioned before that there were those women who were working as the sole breadwinner, but the standard belief at the time, the standard concept, was that women were not going to be the main breadwinner for a family, that was still going to be the husband, the father's job. They were going to be the ones that brought in the most money. Maybe women working in the workforce were doing so just to bring in a little extra kind of thing. And it was just accepted at the time. Now, another area in which women were starting to really make a name for themselves is they were becoming what are called stenographers and typists. Now, a stenographer is someone who sits down at a meeting or a class, or you could be in a courtroom, anything like that, and they copy down every word that is said. They're going to transcribe everything that happens. This is where you're going to have what's known as shorthand, where people can actually quickly write down every single word that was said in a meeting or a classroom or anything along those lines, and then those can be typed up later. Stenographers can, really be a lifesaver for various businesses. The other thing would be typists. Now remember, Christopher Scholes invented the typewriter. We talked about that. Now you're going to be using typewriters for your business. For the most part, before that, all the work you were doing in any kind of office, you were basically going through and you were writing everything out by hand. It's going to take longer. It's not always going to be as clear. So now you have typewritten records. It's going to make life easier on a lot of people. But the thing is, for the stenographers and typists, you cannot argue that these were unskilled labor. No, these jobs actually required a high school education. Now, we spoke about this previously. We said that as education was changing, they were adding various jobs that would help high school graduates actually get employment. And typing was one of them. There are still a lot of schools that offer, today they call them keyboarding classes, but it's basically typing. And I myself went through and took a typing class after I'd graduated high school, and I now type about 80 words a minute, give or take. It's just a lot quicker, it's a lot cleaner, it's a lot neater to be able to type things up than write them out by hand. My handwriting is abysmal. But now you're seeing women that are having these jobs like stenographers, like typists, that require training ahead of time. And with this skilled labor like that, you're able to see women are going to start to be able to demand more income, more money to be paid to them. And this is going to have a long-term change on American society as the women are becoming more important to business. Now, there is one last area of employment that we're going to talk about that was readily open to women at this point in time. Now, keep in mind, like we've been talking about, this is around 1900. Okay, we're looking at the change from the 19th to the 20th century. So you have to keep in account that the world was a very different place at that point in time. So we've talked about women on the farms. We've talked about women in industry. One last area where women were going to find work was as what's referred to as domestic workers. Okay, now a domestic worker was one who basically worked at somebody else's home. Now that we could be talking housekeeping, laundry, cooking, cleaning, childcare, whatever. It's all these different things. Now the thing is, at this point in time, women who had no formal education oftentimes were the ones who took the jobs as domestic workers. They went through and they would, basically see that they had few marketable skills. And as such, they would literally hire themselves out to other families, oftentimes more wealthy families, where they cleaned for that family, they took care of the children, they helped, keep the house in order, things along those lines. And you'll see that this is a point in time, the early 1900s, pre-Great Depression really, there would be different well-off families that might have 5, 6, 7 domestic servants working there for them, doing any number of different tasks and whatnot. There are still a lot of opportunities with domestic care today. One of the biggest, most profitable businesses going on right now is just basic childcare or daycare kind of thing. So there were a lot of jobs that were coming available for women at this time. Now, not all of them were glamorous. Almost none of them were high paying, and very few of them actually carried any kind of feeling amongst the workers that women were being treated as equals. The truth of the matter is they were not. They were being treated at best as second-class citizens. And the upshot of all this is that it did cause some women to want to go through and make sure that a change happened. And we're going to see some of these changes come about. You're going to see, for example, in the not too far off future from here, the passage of the 19th Amendment, which gave women throughout the entire nation the right to vote. So you're going to see that women have, since the beginning of this nation, fought to keep increasing their position within the country. As we got into the 20th century, you're going to see that start to move forward even more so. Have we always been a perfect, wonderful nation in regards to this? No, obviously not. Have we continued to make strides? Yes, we have. Will we continue to improve? Yes, I believe we will. And as a result, we will keep marching forward to a point in time where absolutely everybody will, look at American society and be happy with it.